The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started right at 9 a.m. So hang on short, and we'll be with you shortly. All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. The Wisconsin DNR's Targeted Runoff Management Grant, Developing a Quality Project and Writing a Strong Application webinar is about to begin. I am Whitney Prestby. I am a natural resource educator with UW-Madison Division of Extension, and I'm joined by my colleague Rachel Whitehair, who is also a natural resources educator. Today's webinar is hosted by Extension and the DNR. Joanna Griffin, the Runoff Management Grants Coordinator, is going to be presenting, and Crane Johnson, Nonpoint Source Grant Manager with the DNR, is going to be helping with some of the questions. We at UW Extension have partnered with the DNR for over 9 years, bringing relevant and efficient information to a variety of natural resource, municipal, and other local government professionals, and we're glad to be hosting today's webinar. I just want to go over a couple of the logistics of the webinar. So your control panel, the orange box in the upper left-hand corner, this will help you either hide or expand your control panel. The audio. So most of you are joining us probably by your computer. If you have run into any issues with the audio, lose a connection, you can go into the audio drop box, click on that, and select phone call, and just follow the prompts below to dial in through your phone. If you have questions throughout the webinar, you can ask questions in the drop-down box with the questions. We'll be here to help with any technical support. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to ask them here. Joanna is going to stop at a variety of different places throughout the webinar to answer any relevant or applicable questions that come up for the group. If you have a question that's more specific to your particular project, we will be following up individually. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joanna.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? I just want to make sure it's all set before I go.
It looks like we are seeing your, you might want to change screens. We're seeing the note side. Yep.
Okay, hold on a sec. Slideshow.
If you go into the GoToWebinar,
Yep.
were you able to change the screen, or if you go to present mode and then change the screen, that might be. Yep. And then the display settings, are you able to change the screen? Yeah.
Okay. Does that work?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Here we go. Welcome to today's webinar. We will be covering the Targeted Runoff Management Grant Application Cycle for calendar year 2021 grant awards. My name is Joanna Griffin, and I am the Runoff Management Grants Program Coordinator at the Wisconsin DNR. The agenda for today's webinar includes an overview of the Targeted Runoff Management Grant Program, or TRM Grant Program, information about what's changed since last year, and things to keep in mind as you fill out an application and complete the application process. Let's start with an overview of the TRM program. Our TRM grant website can be found by going to the main DNR website and typing TRM in the search bar. Here you will find tabs with information, applications, and important forms, and links to relevant laws. There are certain things that all TRM grants have in common. Agricultural TRM grants, provide cost share reimbursement for control of non-point source agricultural pollution through the construction and implementation of agricultural best management practices, or BMPs. They offer up to 70% reimbursement of eligible costs in cases of no economic hardship and up to 90% in cases with economic hardship. They only reimburse construction and implementation of BMPs for which no previous offer of NR 151 cost sharing has ever been made. And they only reimburse construction implementation of BMPs located on sites that are not covered by WPDES permits. Now let's go into detail about some of these bullet points. We will return to this slide a couple more times in the presentation. One thing I want to highlight is that the TRM program is a reimbursement grant program. What this means is that no money is provided by the state until money has been spent by the landowner to install BMPs. Under a typical grant for TRM, the landowners spend their money to construct the project, then request reimbursement from the grantee, which is typically a county. The grantee reimburses the landowner based on the cost share rate and the amount spent. Only after the project is constructed and the grantee reimburses the landowner does the grantee request and receive reimbursement from the state. During the steps of the process shaded in gray on the figure, the grantee has paid the money out and is reimbursed by the state in step 11. One acceptable deviation to this sequence is when the landowner completes the project and pays only their share of project costs directly to the vendor, which is typically 30%. The grantee can then pay up to the cost share rate of eligible costs directly to the vendor. This option is advantageous to the landowner because they only have to come up with a local share of project costs rather than full costs and then wait to be reimbursed. The grantee still has to wait for reimbursement, however, and during the steps shaded in gray, the grantee has paid out money and is reimbursed in the last step, 9. Beginning 3 years ago, we made a third option available that allows the grantee to request state share reimbursement from DNR before reimbursing the landowner, as shown in this slide. The reason for adding this option was to increase feasibility of utilizing the TRM grant program in counties that don't have enough cash on hand to reimburse the landowner before being reimbursed by DNR. Another thing that's the same for all TRM grants is that a higher cost share rate is available in cases of economic hardship. In the past, we did not get a lot of requests for economic hardship. However, with the farm economy being what it is right now, we have been getting many more inquiries about this. So I will go into more detail. To do this, let's walk through the economic hardship criteria, which is established in State Rule NR 154.03. In order for a landowner to meet the economic hardship criteria and quality for the higher cost share rate, they must submit an application to the governmental unit, and the governmental unit makes the determination of economic hardship. The governmental unit referred to in NR 154 is the grantee, which is typically a county. So what this tells us is that the determination of economic hardship is typically made by a county based on their evaluation of an application submitted by the landowner. However, keep in mind that in order for the DNR to reimburse the grantee at a higher cost share rate, the 90% rate must be in the cost share agreement between the DNR and the county. So any county that approves the economic hardship must communicate this to the DNR and get the higher cost share rate in the grant agreement. NR 154 provides the information that must be included in the application from the landowner to the grantee in order to evaluate whether economic hardship exists. Either a certified public accountant or an accredited financial institution must certify that the landowner is unable to make the 30% cost share contribution, which is normally required, but is able to make the 10% cost share contribution. A link to NR 154 is found on the TRM grant website that I showed at the beginning. Additionally, NR 154 requires that the landowner provide a sworn affidavit that the information they have provided to the CPA or the financial institution is a full and true disclosure of their financial condition. And while NR 154 does not give DNR authority to specify a method used to determine economic hardship, it does give DNR authority to require that it approve the method used by the CPA or the financial institution to determine economic hardship. Now that we've gone over what all TRM grants have in common, let's look at the different types of agricultural TRM grants. TRM grants are split into two different types based on the problem they address: TMDL and non-TMDL, and size of area they address, large and small scale. So we end up with four different types. TMDL TRM grants are for projects located in watersheds covered by an EPA-approved TMDL, total maximum daily loads. TMDL TRM grants must implement the pollutant-specific goals of an EPA-approved TMDL. In the TRM grant program, BMPs are only eligible for cost share reimbursement if construction of the BMP either 1, achieves compliance with one or more currently non-compliant NR 151 agricultural performance standards and prohibitions, or 2, implements a TMDL. Because non-TMDL aren't located in a TMDL watershed, they therefore must achieve compliance with one or more non-compliant NR 151 performance standards and prohibitions. At facilities that are not now and have never previously been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. And reimbursement is for the compliance costs of existing facilities, croplands only. Oftentimes, however, NR 151 compliance is part of implementing a TMDL. So this means that while non-TMDL TRM grants must address NR 151 non-compliance, TMDL TRM grants may also address NR 151 non-compliance if doing so is required to implement the TMDL. However, unlike non-TMDL TRM projects, TMDL TRM projects can also cost share BMPs that exceed performance standards at sites that are already in compliance, if doing so is required for implementation of pollutant-specific TMDL goals. In other words, if meeting the pollutant load reductions of a TMDL means going above and beyond just implementing performance standards, TRM can fund this. And TMDL TRM grants can also cost share BMPs that address pollution problems for which there is no performance standard, if doing so is required for implementation of pollutant-specific TMDL goals. Let's go through an example to better understand how TMDL and non-TMDL TRM grants are different. For this example, the landowner wants to reduce pollution by stabilizing eroding stream banks. Is this an eligible non-TMDL TRM project? Is it an eligible TMDL TRM project? Let's consider the non-TMDL questions first. Is stream bank stabilization an eligible non-TMDL TRM project? The answer to this is yes. Because this is a non-TMDL trim project, the project must address non-compliance with an NR 151 performance standard. For example, in this photo, we see a situation in which erosion appears to be caused by unlimited livestock access to the stream. Here is a list of the agricultural performance standards and prohibitions from one of the TRM grant applications. Listed at the bottom is the agricultural prohibition, prevention of unlimited livestock access to waters of the state, where high concentration of animals prevent the maintenance of adequate sod cover or self-sustaining vegetation. So if the project is stabilizing stream bank as part of addressing this non-compliance through fencing or relocation, then yes, this is an eligible non-TMDL trim project. You can see the same site in this photo. The stream banks have been revegetated and animals no longer have unlimited access to the stream. Now let's consider the TMDL scenario. Is stream bank stabilization an eligible TMDL trim project? We already learned that both TMDL and non-TMDL trim grants can address non-compliance with NR 151. So the answer has to be yes for the same reason and under the same conditions that non-TMDL projects are eligible. Are there any conditions under which a TMDL trim grant could fund stream bank practices? We learned earlier that TMDL projects can also address pollution sources for which there is no performance standard. So let's consider a scenario in which stream bank erosion is not caused by non-compliance, i.e. unlimited animal access, rather by changes in watershed hydrology due to agricultural land use in the upstream watershed. There is no performance standard that addresses erosion due to upstream changes in hydrology, even though this can be a significant pollution source. In such instances, stream bank stabilization would be an eligible TMDL trim project, as long as the land use in the upstream watershed causing the erosion is agricultural, and as long as the stream bank stabilization implements the pollutant-specific goals of the TMDL. Let's look at the second way that agricultural trim grants are divided. Large scale versus small scale.
Real quick, you know, in the big rooms, we've got the document camera.
As their name suggests, large scale trim grants cover a larger area than small scale. Specifically, small scale trim grant projects typically cover an individual farm, whereas the large scale trim projects cover a watershed, where BMPs are constructed and implemented on multiple sites within that watershed. For non-TMDL projects, the size of the watershed addressed by a large-scale trim project must be between 8 and 39 square miles, whereas the size of a large-scale TMDL trim watershed size is determined by the size of the TMDL watershed. Or, if it's for larger TMDLs, the size of the TMDL watershed reach. The maximum grant award amount for small scale is $225,000, whereas the award amount for large scale projects is $600,000. The small scale trim grant period is 2 years, whereas the large scale trim grant period is 3 years. Both large and small scale trim grantees may request a 1-year project extension. However, extensions are not guaranteed, and grantees cannot apply for a grant with a project schedule that intends to take more than allowed by the initial grant period. Another difference between large and small scale trim grants are the type of project expenses that they can fund. In addition to reimbursing BMP construction costs, small scale trim grantees can request force account reimbursement. The maximum amount of force account that can be reimbursed is 5% of the state share amount reimbursed under that TRM grant project. Large-scale TRM grantees cannot request force account, but can instead request local assistance reimbursement. The maximum amount of local assistance that can be reimbursed is 40% of the amount reimbursed for BMPs. So what is the difference between force account and local assistance? Let's go into a bit more detail. Force account is work done by the grantee's own employees or by the grantee's own equipment that is directly related to the design and construction of BMPs constructed by the project. This is used in small-scale TRM grants. Local assistance is reimbursement for staffing activities needed to carry out the project. Although local assistant activities must be project-related, they don't have to be directly related to the design and construction of installed BMPs, so there's more flexibility. Local assistance is used in large-scale TRM grants. Some examples of eligible local assistant activities are located on this slide. The full list of eligible local assistant activities is in NR 153.16. Another difference between the two grant programs is the type of BMPs the program can reimburse. Small-scale TRM grants can only reimburse construction of structural BMPs, whereas large-scale can also reimburse implementation of cropping practices. Another difference is that small-scale TRM grants can only fund nutrient management plan development if the nutrient management plan is developed in conjunction with construction manure storage or barnyard runoff control projects, which are also funded as part of the same TRM grant. Large-scale TRM can fund nutrient management plans as a standalone practice. Let's look at how the funding is allocated for TRM grants. By far, the majority of funding for TRM grants comes from state bond revenue. Bond revenue can be used anywhere in the state, but it can only be used for construction of structural practices or force account, or activities directly related to the construction of structural practices. It can reimburse nutrient management plans only when it's part of the project that includes the construction of manure storage or barnyards. You can see from this pie chart that the green part of the funding pie representing bond revenue comprises almost 3/4 of the overall program budget. Federal 319 project funds also comprise a significant piece of the overall available funding and can be used for both cropping practices and local assistance. However, these funds can only reimburse work done in areas covered by the EPA approved 9 key element plan. State segregated funds can be used anywhere in the state and can be used for cropping practices and local assistance. Unfortunately, segregated funds comprise a very small sliver of the overall funding available to the project. Over the years, the amount of funding available for cropping practices and local assistance has been limited both in the amount and where it can be used. The department made the decision a number of years ago to prioritize the use of these funds in areas where resources are focused on implementing practices throughout a watershed, like the large-scale TRM project. The reason being is there is much more likely to be a perceivable impact of such practices on water quality when their implementation is focused within a watershed rather than a shotgun approach. This pie chart represents typical funding mix available for TRM awards in past years. So we've already learned that both non-TMDL and TMDL TRM grants can fund NR 151 performance standard compliance at facilities that are not now and have never previously been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. and reimbursement is for compliance costs of existing facilities and cropland only. This type of TRM project, NR 151 compliance, is frequently the source of confusion with the program. Specifically, there's common confusion regarding how to determine whether or not a particular facility meets the eligibility criteria. To help clear things up, let's go through some example scenarios and try to determine if they'd be eligible for TRM grant to address NR 151 compliance. Since non-TMDL TRM grants must address NR 151 noncompliance, I'll refer to this project type as a non-TMDL TRM grant as we go through the examples in the coming slides. However, keep in mind that some TMDL TRM grants also address NR 151 noncompliance, and when they do, the same eligibility criteria apply. Let's go over some examples of eligibility. In the first example, we have a livestock facility that has been in existence since before the effective date of the performance standard being addressed by the project. During the time since the performance standard went into effect, the facility has expanded from 500 to 600 animal units. Is this site eligible for a non-TMDL agricultural TRM grant? It depends. We do not have enough information. Just knowing how many animal units there are doesn't tell us whether the site is eligible for a grant. So let's add more information. Now we know that the performance standard is status. The performance status was compliant before the effective date and is now non-compliant. In this example, the project is not eligible. Even though the site existed at the time the performance standard went into effect, it was in compliance at that time. In order to be eligible for a non-TMDL TRM grant, the facility must not now and never previously have been in compliance since the effective date of the applicable performance standard. If a livestock facility falls out of compliance due to expansion, it is not eligible for a non-TMDL TRM grant. Here's another example. The status was non-compliant and now it's compliant. In this case, the project is not eligible because the facility is already in compliance. In this example, the performance standard status was non-compliant before the effective date and is still non-compliant. This project is eligible. It was in existence and has been continually non-compliant. However, how can it be eligible when the number of animal units has increased from 500 to 600? The reason is that the magnitude of the expansion is not significant as defined by NR 153.15. In this last example, the facility has undergone significant expansion. Like the previous scenario, the site was in existence and continuously non-compliant since the effective date of the applicable NR 151 performance standard. However, unlike the previous scenarios, the number of animal units has increased from 200 to 900. The project is eligible, but only the cost of bringing the facilities in existence on effective data performance standard and prohibition are eligible for cost sharing. So if the landowner is designing a facility for all 900 animal units, the eligible costs must be prorated by determining the base animal units that existed when the performance standard went into effect, and then calculating a non-significant expansion of that number. In this case, a non-significant expansion of 200 animal units is 250 animal units. Since the facility was designed for 900 animal units, the applicant would divide 250 by 900 and determine that 28% of the total project costs are eligible for cost sharing. If this is confusing, don't worry. The form is set up to calculate this for you. If you enter yes to the question about whether the application is a livestock facility, the application will prompt you to enter the number of base and design animal units into Part 3B of the small scale trim application. And the application will tell you, 1, is the proposed increase considered significant or non-significant expansion? And if it is significant, 2, the percentage by which eligible costs must be prorated. Before we move on to the next session, I will pause and we'll take a look to see what questions have come in.
We have no questions at this point.
Okay,
So
I will keep going. So let's go over what's changed since last year's application cycle. So what's new? Nothing was changed in the small scale trim grant applications. However, there are a few notable changes in the large scale trim grant application. And we also have a change in the TMDL equivalent. So let's go over what changed in the large scale trim. Change 1, we decreased the total grant award cap from $1 million to $600,000. We increased the local assistance grant cap from 10% of the BMP grant award to 40% of the BMP grant award. We removed the eligibility requirement of the Wisconsin Buffer Initiative. And we added a list of recommended components for a watershed plan or strategy that's recognized by the DNR as part of determining the eligibility for large-scale non-TMDL trim grant projects. Let's go into a little more detail about these changes. As I mentioned, we decreased the total grant award cap from $1 million to $600,000. This amount is more manageable and will help address significant grant underspending. Applicants are able to apply for successive grants, taking a phased approach to non-point source implementation in a particular watershed. Here is a budget table from the grant application. The sum of column C1, structural practices, and C2, cropping practices, for local assistance needs cannot exceed $600,000. Change number 2, we increased the local assistance grant cap from 10% of the BMP grant award to 40% of the award. This will provide more staff funding to implement large-scale trim projects. Local assistance cannot exceed 40% of the sum of C1, which is structural practices, plus C2, cropping practices, and the total cannot exceed $600,000. Change 3, we removed the eligibility requirement of the Wisconsin Buffer Initiative. The large-scale trim grant instructions have historically included a statement that said if a watershed received no ranking in the Wisconsin Buffer Initiative report, it was not eligible for a grant. We removed this requirement, highlighted in yellow on the screen. The watershed buffer is a helpful tool for prioritizing where non-point source implementation may be most effective, but it will no longer be used to exclude applications. Change 4, we added a list of recommended components for a watershed plan or strategy that is recognized by the DNR as part of determining the eligibility for large-scale non-TMDL trim grant projects. The components were not yet incorporated into the instructions, but were previously posted online. These will provide clear guidance to applicants for non-TMDL projects. The ideal plan for a non-TMDL trim grant is a 9-key element plan. However, county land and water resource management plans will be acceptable plans. Many of these components are already scoring requirements in the application. The other thing that is new is related to TMDL equivalents. We have had requests to fund stream bank projects that are not in TMDL areas and not tied to a performance standard or prohibition. TRM projects seeking to implement stream bank restoration that is not tied to a performance standard or a prohibition violation are not eligible for the non-TMDL project category. They would be eligible as a TMDL project if a TMDL or equivalent to a TMDL exists. For NR 153.145A and NR 153.146A, Wisconsin Administrative Code. Here is a link to the code. These projects mentioned would be eligible as a TMDL project if a TMDL or an equivalent to a TMDL existed. The department has determined that a 9-key element plan with certain criteria would be an acceptable equivalent to a TMDL. The criteria are a watershed inventory that includes a detailed assessment of cropland conditions and stream bank conditions within the watershed, identification of both cropland and stream bank erosion as significant sources of pollutant loading that need to be reduced in the watershed, SEPL or equivalent modeling results that confirm the various sources and total phosphorus and sediment loads coming from these sources in the watershed. The plan should include cost estimates for stream bank, cropland, feedlot, and other practices, and should also contain milestones to address both cropland and stream bank sources in the watershed over the plan's implementation schedule. If you are applying for a TMDL trim grant but plan to use the TMDL equivalent 9-key element plan, please select the TMDL project on the application and make sure to include notes and information related to the 9-key element plan. I will pause again to see if any questions have come in.
We do have one question, and the question was, does a non-TMDL project need to be a parcel-specific recommendation defined in an approved 9-key element plan? And would you like me to take a crack at that one? Okay, so non-TMDL projects, remember, based on what Joanna just shared, need to be focused on implementing and attaining compliance with the performance standards. In a non-TMDL large-scale trim project, those projects also need to be tied to implementing a watershed-based plan that is acceptable to the department, and Joanna outlined what is acceptable. The project does not necessarily need to be parcel specific. Obviously, if there is a watershed-based plan, aka a 9-key element plan that goes to that level of specificity, that's fine. But many 9-key element plans don't necessarily go parcel by parcel by parcel in terms of identifying needs. There should be some way to connect that project to the goals of the watershed-based plan in terms of addressing the significant pollutant sources and a recognition in the plan that that type of practice would be needed for that project. But it doesn't have to be necessarily parcel specific.
Was that the only question?
That was the only question that we have so far.
Okay. So the last.
Oh, now we just got 2 questions that popped in. If these questions are very project specific, we will probably answer them offline. But if they are relevant to the entire state, then we'll answer them with the group here. So hang on one second. The question was, is there an example of a claimed economic hardship on a project? We do have multiple examples of economic hardship type projects, especially recently. We're seeing more and more requests for that. And that's something that we can share with you offline in terms of, an example of an actual project. So yes, that there are examples available that we can share with you. Question was, what if a municipality owns the farmland with the stream bank issue? Well, I think the key here is in most cases, well, in all cases, a local governmental unit needs to be the grantee for a TRM project. In many cases, it happens to be a county land and water conservation department. If a municipality owns the farmland, and the land is still being used for agricultural use, and the issue bringing the stream bank or the non-point source issue to that particular part of the stream bank is also tied to agricultural land use, it could be eligible or would be eligible. It doesn't really matter necessarily if that parcel is owned by a municipality. What we're looking at is the land use and essentially what is causing the non-point source problem in the drainage area for that land. Question was, for large-scale grants, is the money available to be spent in the first year, or is it split up in the 3 years? The money is essentially available for the full 3 years. You don't have to spend it. It's not allocated out year by year by year. So if you ask for $600,000, that $600,000 for that large-scale project is available to you for use in the first year or over the course of the 3 years. Obviously, we would rather see you spend it sooner rather than later, rather than waiting towards the end of the project. But just know that full allocation for the grant award is available to you in that first year for use then over the grant period. Another good question. So for a watershed with a 9-kilometer plan, we can choose whether to apply for non-TMDL or TMDL equivalent. Yes, I think really if you have a project that has Inter 151 performance standards issues, you should choose the non-TMDL project category. The issue of the stream bank work that's not tied to a performance standard issue, we're invoking that TMDL equivalency for the purposes of being able to address that stream bank issue, because that stream bank work is needed to address a significant pollutant source. So if there are Inter 151 compliance issues and there's also a 9-kilometer plan, you really should be focusing your project in that non-TMDL project category. Obviously, if you have a TMDL and the 9-element plan, you should be choosing the 9-kilometer or the TMDL project category. Can one application cover all TMDLs in a county? Likely not. I think that essentially if you have a HUC 12 subwatershed that has a TMDL, that in and of itself would be potentially one large-scale trim project. If you have another TMDL in another sub-watershed, that would be a separate trim project. And the reason being is certain watersheds with certain water quality issues, certain water quality needs, score differently from sub-watershed to sub-watershed. So depending on what the TMDLs are for, you know, you would, plus the project area size gets so big, so you would want to have separate trim projects for the different sub-watersheds, the TMDL watersheds in the county. Lots of questions are flowing in, so just bear with me here. Okay, so if the county owns land where the stream bank project is located in a TMDL watershed with a 9-key element plan, is the county eligible for cost sharing? I'm going to have to check on that. We can look in the code to see if the county, I believe the county can essentially provide cost sharing or provide grant funding to itself, but we will report back on that. You know, again, I think the issue there is you'd want to make sure that the upstream watershed, contributing watershed, essentially is significantly and primarily agricultural based. But the whole issue of the county being able to provide cost sharing to itself, we can get back to you on that. For a 9-key element plan, this is a really good question. Can more than one grant be applied for if the first grant is spent? Most definitely, yes. It is not uncommon in our large-scale project categories we recognize that $600,000 is probably not enough money necessarily to do everything that's necessary in a given 9-key element plan area. Even if that 9-element plan is HUC 12 in, you know, HUC 12 watershed or sub-watershed in size, it's very likely that one large-scale trim project may not be enough. So it is actually really ideal that you, for your first large-scale application, you take a look at your 9-key element plan and kind of work plan and take a phased approach. So maybe you want to start up in the headwaters of your 9-element plan, or maybe you want to look at certain significant pollutant sources that are specified in your 9-element plan and focus on those first. You can take a phased approach by all means. So we would really rather that you pick a plan area and a level of work effort that is manageable within your staff resources and spend all of that first grant, even if you don't ask for the full $600,000. If you ask for $300,000 or $400,000, take that phased approach, spend all that first grant, and as you're coming to the end of your first large-scale project, then come in for an application for a second large-scale project and take that phased effort. That's fine. From earlier slides about if a farm was previously in compliance or not, what if we don't have past records for a particular farm? Well, I think, you know, what we would ask or what we would hope for is that you look at all available data sources, whether it's your own files, your own county files, your experiences in talking with the farmer about their land management history and their history at the farm in terms of how they've managed the farm for a particular facility. Look at aerial photographs, use Google Earth photographs, gather and use, and we make recommendations for various sources of information to tap into. But you know, if you don't have records for a particular farm, we're pretty much kind of forced to assume that it's been for a particular issue has been non-compliant continuously for a given performance standard. But really, we'd like to see that you've tapped into multiple possible information sources to try to gather as much information as you can about the compliance of a particular farm. And that's it for now.
Okay,
Good questions.
so the last thing on the agenda is to go over some things to keep in mind as you fill out your application. These topics to keep in mind are NR 154 revisions, establish and identifying a government authorized representative, contacting your regional and non-point source coordinator to discuss your project. Let's start with the NR 154 revisions. NR 154 identifies agricultural best management practices, or BMPs, that can be funded under the Notice of Discharge and Targeted Runoff Management, or TRM Grant Programs. It identifies the urban best management practices that can be funded under the TMDL, urban construction, and urban planning grant programs. And it identifies cost share conditions for BMPs available for funding in the grant programs above. NR 154 was revised to be consistent with recent updates to Chapter ATCP 50. This includes changes in the flat rates for certain BMPs. Also, NR 154 now identifies additional cost shareable urban BMPs and their technical standards. The proposed rule changes are currently in the legislature. If no hearings are called, we anticipate an effective date of June 1st, 2020. Keep in mind that they are not in effect during the application process, but they should take effect before the grants are awarded. Here is a link to the changes from the June 2019 Natural Resources Board meeting. Also, remember to identify and establish your government authorized representative. Let's go over this in a bit more detail. Only an authorized, responsible government official is authorized to sign your grant application. An executive government responsibility resolution, or a GRR, is required to establish an authorized responsible government official. If you don't already have an executed GRR, think about getting that on the appropriate council or board meeting agenda. The DNR recommends use of a job title rather than the name in the authorizing resolution. For example, city manager or director of public works. So you don't need to execute a new GRR if and when there is staff turnover. This slide here shows the governmental responsibility resolution template that's to be used by grantees in establishing their authorized responsible government official. The GRR must include the language in the box. Pay special attention to the required bullets. The format doesn't matter, but the content does. Another thing to keep in mind as you complete the application is to contact your DNR Regional Non-Point Source Coordinator to discuss your project. Contact your Regional Non-Point Source Coordinator early. Don't wait until the week before the application deadline. The earlier you do this, the better. Your conversation should cover the following topics listed on this slide. Project eligibility, prorating of eligible costs if applicable, proposed BMPs, permits and other feasibility issues, and water quality needs. Leaving a voicemail or sending an email is not the same as having a discussion. If you're not sure who your DNR non-point source coordinator is, refer to this slide and write down the name and contact information of the coordinator for your county. I will leave this up for a minute for you to take a look. And as a last reminder, applications must be postmarked and mailed by April 15th. So we will pause again for questions if there have been any new ones.
No, there have been no new questions.
Okay. So thank you for listening and participating.
Great, thank you, Joanna. I just want to wrap up by saying thank you everyone for participating, for the thoughtful questions that you had. We did record this webinar, so we will be uploading it to YouTube and sharing it through your email. So look for that in the coming days. And again, if you have any questions, we still have a little time, so we can answer a couple of questions, but otherwise, I think we will wrap up early.
We do have one last question that has come in that I can attempt to answer if you'd like.
Sounds great.
Okay. It says, what funding sources can be paired with the TRM funds? That's a really good question. For projects that are using the bond revenue and the segregated funds, the state funds, you essentially can pair you can pair other kinds of funding. You specifically, the administrative code does not allow you to pair the DADCAP, Soil and Water Resource Management funds, the SWARM funds, with DNR TRM grant funds. So that's one area where you cannot, for the 70% of the practice was paid for with TRM funds, you would not be able to use SWARM funds for the 30%. You could, in many cases, we see with the bond revenue for TRM funds, we see that sometimes EQIP dollars, so NRCS funds, will be paired with TRM funds. However, in cases where you're using the Section 319 federal funding that Joanna mentioned, if you're using the federal 319 funds to pay for the TRM or the state share of a given practice, you cannot use another federal source to match that practice and pay for the local share of 30%. So it's kind of the general rule is, if you're using state funds for the 70%, you cannot use another source of state funds for the 30%. If you're using federal funds for the 70%, you cannot use another source of federal funds for the local share of the 30%. The idea being that these are meant to be cost-sharing grants, and so I think the idea is for this, if the state is paying a share, the state's not going to pay the other local share, and if the feds are paying for the TRM grant, the feds are not going to pay then the local share on the 30%. So and that's kind of BMP by BMP. So keep that in mind. Then a follow-up question to that is, are the TRM grants were awarded as all state funds or all federal funds? It can be both. In many of our large-scale TRM projects that have 9 key element plans, that is a criteria for being able to receive the federal funds. In many large-scale TRM projects that have that 9 key element plan, we will award bond revenue and 319 funds in a given grant. Sometimes we will use all state funds in a given grant. Sometimes we will use all 319 funds in a given grant. So it can really be a combination depending on whether or not you have that 9-element plan or not. But we would let you know what funding source we're using prior to awarding the grant. There's one more question I'm just trying to read here. Does a county resolution authorizing proper county officials to apply for the TRM grant suffice the GRR requirements? The GRR needs to include more than just an authorization of who can apply for the TRM grant. There's other steps in the grant process that we would want to see in that GRR should you be awarded the grant. So if you look in the instructions for the TRM application, we actually provide a sample resolution that outlines, it's one of the attachments or the appendices. It actually provides a recommendation of the various grant process steps that you should really have authorization and authorizing official for. And it would be in your best interest to have a resolution that includes all of those rather than going in for a separate resolution for each of those grant steps. Can non-TMDL TRM grants be used on farms that do not meet all of the NR151 requirements at the end of the project? That's a really good question. You know, in some cases, when you go out to a farm, you're going to see multiple NR151 compliance issues or non-compliance issues. You can apply for a non-TMDL TRM project to address one performance standard. Let's say they have 4 performance standards violations. You could apply for a small scale, as an example, a small scale non-TMDL TRM project to address one performance standard or prohibition violation. But the goal of that project is to attain compliance for that performance standard. So that should be the outcome of that project. You could come in then for another small scale TRM project for that farm to address another performance standard violation. Obviously, if you can address multiple violations in one project, that's in your best interest, you know, in terms of efficiency, in terms of the work effort it takes to apply and administer the grants and that sort of thing. So if within the grant caps, you can make that 70% offer of cost sharing that's necessary to achieve compliance, by all means, try to address more than one violation. But that also doesn't stop you from addressing that farm in multiple projects if need be. But again, the goal of any given project for the non-TMDL project category is to achieve that compliance for a particular performance standard. And no additional questions at this point. I think we would encourage all of you, if you've got additional questions like Whitney and Joanna said, please direct them to your regional non-point service coordinator and be sure to contact them early prior to the grant application deadline.
All right, well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us this morning. And thank you to Joanna and Corrine for your great insight.
Thank you, Whitney and Rachel.
All right, everyone, have a great day.